Hello and welcome to Türkiye Talks. UN General Assembly is over. The leaders joined and they made their speeches. It was a very fruitful week for diplomats and the analysts who cover international relations. Today I'm joined by Jeffrey Mankoff. Jeffrey, welcome.
Thank you.
And Kadir, as usual, we will talk about what has happened in New York at the United Nations. There are some side events or the results of these diplomatic activities. For example, Russians and Ukrainians made a prisoner swap deal. From Turkish perspective, Turkey made its statement, especially about the injustices in world politics, and also maybe we can talk a little bit about Turkish-American relations. Jeffrey, I would like to start with you. You cover or study mostly Russia and that region. I'd like to ask you your reaction and analysis about this prisoner swap, because it came just after Putin announced his decision to expand recruiting people. He called for a new national recruitment. What was the reason behind these two events, the Putin's decision, then this prisoner swap? How do you analyze it?
Sure. Thank you. And thanks for having me on this morning. It is striking because these two events seem to pull in very opposite directions. On the one hand, the prisoner swap suggests that diplomatic channels are still open and that there is some trade space available. At the same time, the military call-up indicates, at least in an indirect way, that Putin is seeking to escalate the conflict. I think on the prisoner swap, it's important to keep in mind who exactly was being swapped. So among the people that Russia got back, there were a relatively small number of POWs, I think 55, but also Viktor Medvedchuk, who was Putin's proxy in Ukraine and who was captured by Ukrainian forces in the early days of the conflict. Now, Medvedchuk is widely loathed in Russia and in Ukraine. And the fact that Putin wanted him back and was in fact willing to trade a larger number of Ukrainians, including the commanders of the Azovstal brigade, who previously they'd talked about holding war crimes trials for, suggests that they put a lot of priority on getting Medvedchuk back. Now we can speculate as to why. Clearly, Medvedchuk knows where a lot of the skeletons, both figurative and literal probably, are buried. But nevertheless, I mean, I think you have to think about this particular agreement not only in terms of what does it mean as far as the conduct of the war and the relationship between Moscow and Kyiv, but also about the role that this particular individual plays and the significance that he has for Putin and for the Russian leadership. Now, at the same time, as I said, Medvedchuk is very widely disliked, both in Ukraine and in Russia, and the nationalist right in Russia, which has been pushing for an escalation of the conflict, was extremely unhappy with the exchange, especially because it meant giving up these Azovstal fighters who the Russian sort of nationalist right views as being neo-Nazis and was kind of whipped up by the promise that had earlier been made that they would be facing war crimes trials in Russia. So that step was very unpopular among this group. Now, this group had been pushing Putin for an escalation of the conflict. They'd been humiliated by the retreat from Kharkiv a week or so ago, and felt that Putin had not been doing enough to adequately prosecute the war. Wouldn't even call it a war, right? It was just calling it a special military operation. So in order to mollify that crowd, Putin also announced the mobilization, something that Russia or the Soviet Union hasn't done since 1941, So a rather significant step, even if the military analysis community is still trying to parse out exactly what it means. But the mobilization is driven in large part by domestic factors. The fact that there is an emerging and increasingly powerful right-wing critique of Putin for not prosecuting the special military operation, with enough vigor. In this group of people who are in the military and the security services, some of it is online commentators, has been pushing for mobilization for a long time. And I think particularly in the aftermath of the debacle in Kharkiv and the fact that Russian forces remain on the defensive and are losing ground in the south around Kherson, made this critique of Putin's management and leadership of the war stronger. And so the mobilization has the goal, at least in part, of mollifying this group of domestic critics within Russia. I think it also addresses one of the key vulnerabilities that Russia has in Ukraine, which is that they're trying to occupy a very large area, and they haven't had sufficient forces to do that for quite a while. So even if this mobilization doesn't dramatically increase the offensive capabilities of the Russian military, because they're still lacking in equipment, training, logistics, and everything else, it does mean that they'll be able to to man the territories that they do hold at a higher level. And they'll be able to rotate some of their forces out. But certainly it indicates that they're girding for a long conflict, and that the negotiations, the prisoner exchange, don't suggest that any diplomatic solution to the conflict is anywhere near.
Jeffrey, I want to ask you a question. You were in New York, you got to observe the UN events, and there were many speeches, as you know, and perhaps my question is related to perhaps looking at the Ukraine war in terms of the international system. Right before the UN General Assembly meetings in New York, you and I both attended, or we were here in New York. There right before then there was this Shanghai 5 meetings. It's no longer 5, but how do you assess Putin's behavior and how he looked there? And there was some not so subtle criticism of his policies by others. What does this really mean for kind of the structure of the international system? There's been a lot of talk about non-Western countries coming together and doing things outside the West. But at the same time, there were clear disagreements between Russia and China and others, while, the West, let's say, quote unquote, Western club was in the UK. So how does that picture what does it tell us? You can talk about the Ukraine war, but more broadly, the international system, how it's playing out.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think that the international system is becoming, I won't say multipolar, but is becoming more dynamic. The centrality of the West to the operation of that system, I think, has diminished since the end of the Cold War. And that's in part a result of the West's own problems, political and economic, but it's also a reflection of the successes that other non-Western countries have had in developing their own political, economic, military capabilities during that period. So in some ways, it's a natural progression. That said, it's striking that we have this term, the West, but when we're talking about everyone else, we use this term, the non-West, because there isn't really a clear unity or sense of identity among countries outside the West. There's a wide range of political models that those countries have. There's a big difference, for instance, between the Turkish system and the Chinese system. There are radically different outlooks in terms of what issues or priorities should be focused on. There's not a kind of general, sense of the non-West as a collective, the way that there is, with the West, which is based on a certain set of principles. And so I think we are moving into an era which has more actors that are capable of affecting things at the systemic level. Groups like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, I think, are an attempt to consolidate this non-West into something a little bit more cohesive. But I'm a little bit skeptical about the efficacy of those efforts and of groups like the SCO. If you think about the SCO, it contains both Russia and China, which have clear common interests in weakening the West and checking the dominant role of the United States in the international system. You also have India, which very much pursues its own line on the international stage, and which is very closely aligned with the United States in the so-called Quad. And you also have Pakistan, which has fought a series of wars with India in the not too distant past, and still sees India as being a major threat. So you have this very broad grouping of countries whose cooperation and unity is not very deep. The SCO, is not analogous to NATO or the European Union or any of these much more institutionalized Western clubs. So I don't think it's worth reading too much into that organization as an organization. It's important because it does bring together the leadership of a wide range of non-Western countries, as we saw with the meeting in Samarkand last week. But again, the range of views on offer diverges pretty significantly, and we saw that with the responses to the war in Ukraine and the rather direct criticism of the war that was leveled by Prime Minister Modi, and the somewhat more indirect but still striking discomfort with the war that was expressed by Chinese President Xi Jinping.
Quickly, Biden made some suggestions about the UN structure. Turkey has been calling for a restructuring of the UN system, and others have called in the past. We know, given the privileged status of 5 countries at the UN Security Council, how likely do you think any significant change can happen anytime soon? Those countries probably won't want to give up their privileged position. But beyond that, do you think that indicates even the United States is no longer that happy that, the UN Security Council is becoming actually more and more ineffective because, China, Russia, there's very little cooperation in recent years. We saw that with Syria, we saw that with other issues. The UN Security Council has become less and less kind of effective.
Yeah, it's a difficult problem because the 5 veto-wielding members, the P5, would have to unanimously agree to any change. And especially now, given the deep divisions among them, I think that would be hard. President Biden's address, where he called for UN reform, I think was notable coming from an American president. He talked about expanding the ranks of the Security Council, perhaps giving new members a seat, but not the same veto rights as the current P5. That is certainly a possibility. I think you'd struggle to agree on who the new members should be. But at least, this is an issue that is being discussed at the highest levels now, and maybe you could see some movement on it down the road. But I'm not super optimistic on that front. Despite all of the criticisms that are leveled against it, though, I will say that I think the UN Security Council, at least in theory, plays an important role, which is that it brings the major powers, the great powers, together. And in giving them a veto, it, in theory at least, gives them all a reason to buy into the system. Now, I think the problem has come where those great powers, including the United States, have acted outside the framework of the UN system in taking decisions about war and peace. And we can go back to the war in Iraq for an example of that. But I think you're seeing that more and more, and that's one of the reasons that the UN system and the UN Security Council in particular doesn't seem as effective now as it was, say, during the Cold War.
Well, maybe we should talk a little bit more about Turkish-US relations, but before that, Kadir, I want to ask you about the visit of the president, Turkish president this time. He started with a nice walking tour in Central Park. He chatted with the people from different nations, and he looked more self-confident and calm. When we look at his speech in the General Assembly, he underlined Turkey's position, and he was firm when it came to Turkish-Greek relations or the situation in Eastern Mediterranean. But the tone of the speech was more compromised. He was firm, but not very harsh when he criticized countries like Greece and others. How do you evaluate his visit? Also, when he was asked about if he's going to meet with the US president, he seemed not very interested in that meeting, although he joined the reception. I don't know if it is maybe because Biden seems not very reliable in terms of his health. You know, he is getting instructions, he's reading from papers when he speaks, or is it something else when it comes to Turkish demands for F-16s and other stuff in general? How was this trip for Turkish-US relations?
I mean, President Erdogan's visit to New York, to me signifies, two important things. One, the ongoing commitment to the international system. I mean, President Erdogan came last year when many leaders didn't come because it was still pandemic situation, and he inaugurated the Turkish house right across from the UN. It's a 36-story building. It's very impressive, but that kind of investment and regular sort of contribution to the international system is showing that Turkey does not just want to be a player. Obviously, it's already a player on a number of global and regional issues, and critical ones. Like earlier, Jeff was talking about the prisoner deal. Turkey has a critical role in that. So that ongoing commitment on President Erdogan's part, but also more broadly on Turkey's part to the international system is interesting, right? So we are talking about the UN not being so effective and countries not being able to cooperate. There are all these varying interests. But in his speech also, President Erdogan kept underlying the need to work together. So like Jeff was saying, UN structure is problematic. Reform definitely is needed, but it remains an institution that can bring countries together, get them to talk and get them to negotiate, etc. And then Turkey has specific suggestions, like President Erdogan has talked about enlarging the UN Security Council to allow all members on a rotational basis. They could take part. Some sort of new design could be implemented where many more countries are actually included in that system, and they take they can make decisions that are consequential for the world, for the globe. So that's the international system part. That's important, I think. From the national interest, Turkish national interest viewpoint, like you mentioned, there are recent issues about Greece, Eastern Mediterranean. There are, the ongoing difficulties with the U.S. policy on Syria. So he highlighted those, and he repeated Turkish positions. The tone, like you mentioned, maybe was not as perhaps harsh or combative, but I think he made the same points about Turkey. Turkey's interests, and then the meeting with Biden, I don't think it was more of a scheduling complication than anything else. I don't think Biden held many bilateral meetings on the sidelines of the UN at all because of the Queen's funeral in the UK. The schedule was very tight, and President Erdogan had important meetings. Israeli Prime Minister meeting was, I think since 2008, that was the first sort of the highest level meeting that Israeli Prime Minister had with the Turkish side. So recently, as you know, Turkey and Israel made up, and Israeli ambassador has already been appointed. So those bilateral meetings with other countries are important for Turkey as well. It's UN week is very internal. It can be very efficient, cost effective. You have all these leaders here within a couple of days. You can have multiple meetings with them, and of course the foreign ministers, and they're all meeting each other. So much can be done in the way of negotiations. Can much be accomplished in terms of results through the UN system? That's another question. So I think Turkish leadership got what it wanted in terms of advocating for national interest, bringing up the international systems failures, and also, but in the meantime, continuing to play a critical role in conflict regions, including Ukraine and others. So in that sense, it was quite a successful visit by the Turkish president. President said he's gonna follow up with Biden over phone and other avenues. So these issues don't go away just because you didn't get to meet one-on-one, but I think maybe we'll go into that. The classic ongoing serious policy disagreements remain, especially about Syria between the United States and Turkey.
Yeah, this meeting with Israeli Prime Minister was really interesting. The last one, when you said, I remember, it was with Ehud Olmert. At that time, Erdogan was the Prime Minister, and it was just before the Gaza operation of Israel, and Turkey was trying to mediate between Syria and Israel. Yeah. So that was an important meeting. So after 14 years, Turkish and Israeli leaders are meeting more frequently. But I want to go back to Russian policy in the region. Actually, I was going to say the U.S. lifted arms embargo to Greek Cypriot side a couple of days ago. And after that, we heard from Russians there might be direct flights from Russia to Turkish Cypriot side. Do you think, Jeffrey, the island of Cyprus or Eastern Mediterranean can be another field of competition between the US and Russia, or this is just a side story of the major disagreement between the two countries?
Yeah, so the Eastern Mediterranean is already a zone of competition between, let's say, not just the US and Russia, but NATO and Russia. The intervention in Syria has allowed Russia to substantially increase its force posture in the region. It has now an upgraded naval base on the Eastern Mediterranean at Tartus in Syria, as well as the airport and associated facilities around Latakia. So those forces, which include air defense, coastal defense, as well as port facilities that Russian ships can use, mean that Russia already has the capability to impose costs on US or NATO operations in the Eastern Mediterranean. Before the start of the war in Ukraine, the most recent phase of the war in Ukraine in February, Russia's military buildup in the Black Sea played a similar role as well. Now with Turkey's closure of the straits and the success of Ukrainian anti-ship capabilities in driving much of the Russian Black Sea fleet back to port in Crimea and even in Novorossiysk, that threat of Russia projecting power out of the Black Sea and into the Eastern Mediterranean is checked, at least for the time being. However, I think Russia still views the region as a zone of competition with NATO and is looking for opportunities to enhance its capabilities to operate there. Earlier, there'd been discussions with the government of the Republic of Cyprus about Russian naval ships being able to do port visits, to have some kind of facility on Cyprus, which eventually was not accepted, I think in part because of pressure from the EU and the United States. But if Russia were able to gain that kind of a toehold in the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, I think certainly it would take the opportunity to do so. At the same time, I think it's worth keeping in mind that Russia does still have close relations with Greece, with certain elements in Greece and in Greek Cyprus. So that would be there would be second order effects that I think the Russians would be cautious of courting in terms of their relationships with Nicosia and Athens. But this is a dynamic situation, and again, I think Russia does view the Eastern Mediterranean as an area of priority where it seeks to develop a greater presence and inhibit the operations of NATO forces. And if it are able to do that through some kind of an agreement with either side in Cyprus, I think it would at least be interested in pursuing that.
Yeah, when it comes to checking Russian power, actually, I believe that Turkey played an important role during the last couple of years in Syria, in Libya, even in Karabakh, in other parts of the region. But still, we see that the US is not very willing to support Turkey's demands for having at least F-16s. I mean, it seems sometimes to me that the US is trying to implement a policy of double containment to Turkey and Russia at the same time by limiting arms and also supporting Greek armaments and building bases in this part of the world. What do you think after the visit of the president to the US? He met with Lindsey Graham, senators like Chris Coons and James Rich. Do you think this will have an impact on Turkey's purchase of F-16s? What is your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't seen any readouts of those meetings. I think the fact that they took place is positive because the opposition to the F-16 sales right now is really in Congress. And I think that historically Turkey has not done as good a job engaging with Congress as it has engaging with the administration. And so the fact that these meetings are taking place, these issues are being discussed, I think is a positive step. There is a domestic political context in the United States to all of this. There are much more developed Greek, as well as Armenian, not to mention Jewish, lobbying groups, influence on the Hill is pretty well developed, and that's largely through the activism of immigrant communities and their descendants. And there's not really a comparable Turkish presence. So I think that there is often a domestic political price to be paid for being seen to be too overtly pro-Turkish, especially at times when the bilateral relationship is difficult, as it has been for the last several years. So the Biden administration has made clear that it wants the F-16 deal to proceed, but it needs to get Congress's buy-in to do that. And I think the fact that President Erdogan was actively engaging with Congress on this issue is a good step. And I can't predict how Congress is ultimately going to act on this, but I do think that the combination of thaw in Turkey's relationships with countries like Israel and more outreach in Washington are certainly positive steps that might make that positive outcome more likely.
Bora, I
yeah,
have,
please.
yeah, I would like to make a comment about this as well. I agree with Jeff that, you know, the key players in Senate who are going to be, you know, approving or disapproving the F-16 sales are meeting President Erdogan, so that's very important. One-on-one, they came to the Turkish house and met. Of course, the context is Turkey's purchase of original, you know, S-400s and then exclusion from the F-35 program, and then now Turkey wants to keep its F-16 fleet up to date and, you know, upgrade it and purchase even more F-16s. You know, from a NATO perspective, this is going to increase NATO's or sustain NATO's capabilities, maintain its capabilities, and there is no question about, you know, interfering with the F-35 system or you know, jeopardizing any kind of security for the NATO alliance. On the contrary, right? But like Jeff said, the congressional relations have always been very difficult for Turkey, except for certain short periods of time where Turkey was able to leverage others' lobbying powers in Congress, including that of Israel's in the late 90s and early 2000s, perhaps. So the part of the problem from a Turkish perspective is Greece's recent sort of efforts to sort of empower itself or kind of use the negative sort of perception of Turkey in Congress in its favor. And President Biden has a strong record on Greece from the Greek perspective, and I think they want to take advantage of that. So they want to, prevent Turkey from getting even F-16s. The Greek Prime Minister advocated for that position in Congress. It's a kind of a problematic, stance, because both Greece and Turkey are NATO allies, and NATO armies, NATO capabilities should be maintained and strengthened. That should be the ideal thing. And then, Bora, you mentioned, the arms embargo being lifted to, the Greek Cypriot part of Greece. I mean, from American perspective, it's arms embargo to Greece, but Cyprus. But Turkey doesn't see Cyprus as one country. Anyway, we know the story. But the point is, I think that could be part of Biden administration's negotiations with Congress. Because Congress has been trying to impose some conditions on that F-16 sale, saying that somehow Turkey should not threaten Greece, etc. Give us some guarantees or give us something that will help our our votes with our constituencies. So I'm not. That could be related to that. I'm not 100% sure about that, but that basically gives congressional members, senators, something in return for approving the F-16 deal. But Turkey has already said, if there are conditions on F-16 sale, they won't be interested. Like if you tie it to somehow, Turkey shouldn't do this and that on the other political level or military level, Turkey won't accept that sale, because they already feel like the quote-unquote punishment, the exclusion from the F-35 program in response to the S-400 sale was disproportionate. It didn't meet, it wasn't, S-400 sale was a different thing, but U.S. administration tied it to F-35 program, and then they, this was a mismatch in the Turkish opinion. And if they see another mismatch in the F-16 case, meaning, if you buy F-16s, you have to treat Greece in this way or that way, they won't go for it. So there are some risks, but again, as we mentioned earlier, one-on-ones with the senators on the sidelines of the UN was probably very helpful, both for Turkey to understand Congress's position, but also for congressional members to understand Turkey's position, because it's really hard to oppose F-16 when Turkey has been operating these systems for a long time, and it has used it as part of the NATO alliance, and so it's very important for Turkish security as well. So hopefully the deal will go through, and that would be a boon to Turkish-US relations, I think.
Okay, Kadir, thank you. With that, we came to the end of our show. Jeffrey Mankoff, thank you very much. Kadir, thank you very much. Hope to see you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks.